So let's talk about one of the changes over time in children's word learning preferences. In particular, as they acquire more knowledge, does their behavior for word learning change over time? Hint, hint, it does. Right, so in particular, the study by Jenkins and colleagues in 2015 was looking at the Shu and Tannenbaum 2007 model, which says, okay, when you have a suspicious coincidence, that's because you know the set sizes of things, that the set of Dalmatians, for example, is much smaller than the set of dogs, and so your bias for the smaller hypothesis when you get an ambiguous item labeled, say, as a FEP, should grow stronger, right? So the more you know, the more members at both the subordinate and basic level you know, the stronger this preference should be. However, what they found is that children with more knowledge of how many members are in each category actually demonstrated less sensitivity to suspicious coincidences. So this is what's shown in these two graphs here, where I've sort of whited out the graph we're not going to look at there on the right-hand side. But we have the less knowledge and the more knowledge kids, right? So when these kids are given one example of a FEP, right? And I say, here's this, it's a FEP, right? Then both of these kids generalize to the basic level category about the same amount of time. So we have the y-axis is how often are you thinking that this refers to a dog rather than just a Dalmatian, and it's like, 25% or something. Fine. Okay, this is their basic level bias. Versus when given 3 different subordinate examples of FEPs, so 3 different Dalmatians labeled FEPs, then children with more knowledge of how many Dalmatians there are in the world and how many dogs there are in the world still generalized to the basic level, still thought that FEP referred to all classes of dogs, versus our kids who didn't really know how many Dalmatians and dogs there were in the world did the very Bayesian thing. And at least, according to the model we saw from Shu and Tannenbaum 2007, where they said, well, it's very unlikely for FEP to mean dog if I saw 3 different Dalmatians labeled FEP and I didn't see any other dogs, So they did what they were supposed to do. But this is, this pattern of the kids that have less knowledge showing the suspicious coincidence more, and the kids with more knowledge showing not really any suspicious coincidence behavior, is weird, right? Under this sort of the basic version of what's going on here. And so Jenkins and friends said, exactly this, what is going on, right? And the answer is that they said was that the Bayesian model in isolation in its current form, can't capture this behavior. But one possibility is that you've actually gained additional knowledge over time about the kinds of labels certain kinds of things tend to get. So one example of this in English is that in general, subordinate level categories are labeled with compound labels, that is, labels made up of 2 different words. Now, Dalmatian is an exception to this, but sheepdog, for example, delivery truck, bell pepper, or if we go back to some of the actual examples from Shu and Tannenbaum's experiment with kids, green pepper, right? Two words together to make a single compound word for subordinate level categories, versus basic level categories tend to have single morpheme labels, that is, labels made up of a single word, like dog or truck or pepper. And guess what? When you hear FEP, FEP is a single morpheme label, right? So if you've realized this overall pattern in English, you might have the behavior we saw from the experiment with those kids. And in fact, when they looked, they said, this is not crazy to think that kids would have, because in child-directed speech, the kind of input that these kids would be getting, the compound nouns are subordinate level categories nearly 3 times out of 4, right? So sheepdog, that kind of word, is often subordinate level categories, but single morpheme labels like FEP are basic level categories nearly 95 times out of 100, right? So there's a really strong preference, so that when you hear something like FEP, you might think it's a basic level thing, and you won't have to do any inference over, which is more or less likely. You've already developed this language-specific bias for what kind of labels go with what kind of reference. So because of this, therefore, the more experienced child in English hears FEP, she assumes it's a basic level item because that's the bias, the language bias she's picked up from her language, and she's no longer relying on the relative sizes of sets.